Chapter 3. Deep within the Peppermint Castle's cellar, the moans and groans of a secret dance can be faintly heard. "Ooh, Dr. Licorice, you have the fluffiest tail in the kingdom," groans Mr. Glyce, whose veiny, violet hand strokes a wiggling red and black striped tail. "You better not yank it," whispers Dr. Licorice. Mr. Glyce grins, revealing his pink, cleary teeth, grips the tail, and gives it a quick yank, causing a satisfying pop and whimper from Dr. Licorice. "That hurt. You better not do it again. I'm the head of security. I'll do what I damn please." Mr. Glyce gives it another yank and causes Dr. Licorice to moan and shiver. Suddenly, the floor begins to shake violently beneath their feet and below a covering that leads to the sewer. "What did you do?" says a paranoid Dr. Licorice. "Relax, it's probably just the rain from the storm. Just one more quick yank. Then your punishment is over," pleads Mr. Glyce, whose mind is still gripped by the claws of lust. Before he can give another yank, the sewer covering bursts open, letting out an orange pungent wave that picks them up and carries them, at a breakneck speed, beyond the boiler room's doorway and through the maze of golden tile floors and tapestry-adorned hallways. It ends with a splash and a crash into a large tank, tipping it over and spewing its crimson water and scaly teal beast into the orange deluge. "Pure tang!" screams Mr. Glyce as he bursts out of the rising, waist-high pool of tang. His eyes burn and his skin is orange and puffy. He spits, coughs, screams, and flails as he tries to locate his special friend. "Doctor, are you with me? Don't drink it." A muffled cry and the sounds of wet, smacking lips are heard coming from behind Mr. Glyce. He turns and strains to see what appears to be a lover's quarrel between a wide, smiling fish with lips and a whimpering fool. "Shoo, it's all right, sweetie," says the surprisingly sexy beast. Its floppy lips smack as it prepares for another kiss. The poor fool whimpers and wiggles his red and black striped tail, which catches Mr. Glyce's attention, and he immediately recognizes his friend, the fool. "You get away from him!" shouts Mr. Glyce, who lunges and grabs onto his dear friend's tail. The grinning and giggling teal beast winks its yellow eyes at Mr. Glyce and grabs Dr. Licorice by his neck and gives it a yank to free him from the grip of Mr. Glyce. But the head of security's grip is too strong and causes Dr. Licorice to cry and spit out a spray of tang onto the face of the teal beast, who whistles in disgust. Mr. Glyce sees his opportunity and quickly yanks back as hard as he can, causing the tail to tighten and pop. Distracted by the surprisingly juicy pop, Mr. Glyce loses his grip, falling backwards into the now chest-high pool of tang. All over his body, he feels his skin expand and tighten as the tang becomes more and more entrenched. Mr. Glyce shakes his body in defiance and pulls himself to the surface. "Doctor!" A scarred face with a green mustache pops out of the water a few feet in front of him, quickly followed by two more. "That was fun," says Glux as the others giggle and cough up tang. Mr. Glyce screams and turns to swim in the opposite direction, but runs directly into a pair of smiling orange glowing lips. Meanwhile, the king sits hunched on his sugar throne, looking out amongst his panicking sweeties and their families who have taken shelter from the storm within the fortified royal chamber. Mrs. Licorice, with her son in tow, makes her way through the chamber searching for her husband. She comes upon a stern-looking Mr. Kane, who is staring out a large window that overlooks the flooding city below. The waters of the Peppermint River have risen up past Peppermint Hill and are creeping up the castle walls. "Excuse me, Cokie, have you seen my husband? He didn't come home last night," Mr. Kane answers without looking away from the scene below, almost hypnotized and a little annoyed to hear his first name used like that. "What a sour sight. Keep the boy back. He shouldn't see this." "See what?" says the excited and curious Licorice boy as he pushes past his mother and jumps up, balancing his fat little belly on the ledge to see the scene outside. "Oh wow, those look like fun," says the Licorice boy, who points at a group of large pink bubbles as they rise into the odious ick and dance with its flickering lightning and whipping rain. The Licorice boy becomes excited as two bubbles collide and pop, sending two citizens of the Peppermint City screaming back down into the raging waters below. "Oh my, were those?" wonders the worried mother, who fears that maybe one of them was her Dr. Licorice. Mr. Kane nods solemnly, then bites into one of Mrs. Corntart's sweet biscuits with yuffie jam. He gets lost in its deep flavor profile when the sound of another screaming bubble brings him back to the sad face of Mrs. Licorice and her very hungry child. It's been going on non-stop for the past hour. It appears the storm has flooded the castle's carbonation hut. The waters surrounding the castle have been turned into a fizzy juice. Most have drowned from exhaustion. These are yummy. Can I have some? Begs the little licorice boy as he pokes Mr. Kane's belly and steals a sweet biscuit from his right coat pocket. Mr. Kane grumbles, but decides to forgive and forget due to the current state of the licorice family. Despite everything, the mother is happy to see her son eating something that makes him happy. If he had a tail, it would be wagging right now, Mrs. Licorice, says Mr. Kane. The licorice boy stops chewing when he sees what appears to be a giant fishman head slowly floating towards him. Its dopey yellow eyes and crimson-colored lips have been enlarged due to the magnifying glass-like effect of the thick syrup, fooling the young licorice boy. If he can just reach the floating head, which he thinks he can finally eat it and become a big boy like his father. He quickly unlatches the window and pops his fat little belly from its perch on top of the windowsill and into the outside world as the child begins to slip forward, his prize mere feet away. "Anise!" yelps his mother as she jumps into action, just in time to grab his fat right ankle. Mr. Kane sighs and reluctantly grabs a flap of flesh as they both pull at the little whining and snorting licorice boy who stretches out his tongue for the delicious treat. With a burst of wind, the bubble is pushed forward and the little licorice boy's tongue finally makes contact with the yummy treat. But the hungry boy is stunned as the bubble pops suddenly and its meaty contents disappear into the bubbling brew below. No, it's not fair. I want to eat the head like father. I want to be big, yells the licorice boy who is now in a suffocating hissy fit as he is pulled back into the chamber. "You're too greedy," sneers Mr. Kane while his grip on the flap of flesh tightens and pinches the licorice boy. The licorice boy screams and kicks Mr. Kane in the crotch, who then releases his grip on the boy and allows him to run and pout beneath a long zinda table in the nearest corner of the royal chamber. "Koki, what has gotten into my son? Where is my husband?" wonders an overwhelmed Mrs. Licorice. Before Mr. Kane can answer, a hush is brought over the anxious crowd as the doors to the royal chamber slowly open with a low melodious groan. In the doorway stands a giggling and puffing Turg. His white hooded cloak is surprisingly clean. "There he is, the king!" yells Turg, who panics and turns to run back through the doorway, but is blocked by Blich, who pushes Turg back into the royal chamber. The crowd of sweeties gasp and retreat in horror at the sight and smell of Blich, who is covered from head to toe in an orange slime. "Good evening, royal sweeties and peppermint people alike. We mean you no harm," says Blich as he raises his arms above his head and struts his way into the royal chamber, leaving an orange trail. "We come bearing good news." Screams erupt as the three slimy and strange bodies of the sea mantis, Dr. Licorice and Mr. Gleiss, are tossed, one by one, into the royal chamber, causing 3 loud wet smacks. More screams are heard as Blich's equally slimy bats enter, diving over the bodies and forming a half circle of support behind Blich. Turg hides and cowers behind them. "They killed the doctor," cries Mr. Kane. "No," screams Mrs. Licorice. "We actually saved them from being devoured by this strange beast," says Blich, pointing at the sea mantis. "Oh," gasps Mrs. Licorice. "Hey!" moans the creature as it winks at Mr. Kane. "Who in the sour sea are you?" says Mr. Kane as he tries to control himself from puking up one of Mrs. Corntart's biscuits. "We are broomers." "Broomers? Never heard of them," says Mrs. Corntart. "Of course not. We are ancient keepers of Hemigia. Our story has been literally washed away by the trash spirit and its odious ick." "The trash spirit? Odious ick? You don't make any sense," replies Mr. Lemondrop. "The odious ick has returned." "You brought it here," yells Mr. Kane. "Kill Therm," screams the purple and sugar plum-like face of Mr. Gleiss, who has been awakened by the hard fall. "Is that Mr. Gleiss?" wonders Mrs. Corntart to the king. The king nods with a smile on his face. A cry of moo moo is heard from above. It is followed by a deafening clang as two knights with red and white striped lollipop hammers named Sukra and Ss drop to the ground in between the broomers and the royal crowd. Moo moo, moans the quintessentially dim-witted. Untie him at once, squeals Sukra in his high-pitched, shrill voice. Untie him? That's dangerous, says Blich as he takes a few more steps toward the knights. Please tell me, does the king of this country allow for such a risk? The king doesn't respond, and Sukra and SACC see that as a reason to stomp their feet and raise their lollipop hammers. SACC's mouth begins to bubble with drool and drip down his chin. BATS, ready yourselves, yells Blich, drawing his bone knife from his belt. While the BATS reach to their belts and retrieve their sharpened whale penis whips, relics of the great General Dush himself and stolen from Say's Uncle Pip. They smell bad, screams D as he runs at the broomers, wildly swinging his hammer. They scatter to avoid the giant lollipop hammer, but the poorly sighted Turg isn't as quick to react and watches SACC's lollipop hammer connect with his left arm. A sickening wet thud fills the air when Turg's very orange limb is ripped off like string cheese. Yee-I-I-Tai-Ikis, screams Turg. His wound, oddly, has very little blood flowing from it. SSC doesn't notice this oddity while he readies himself for the killing blow. He stops when he hears a strange little voice coming from Turg's armhole. You want me? Suddenly, a green spray containing 10 little goobines shoot out of Turg's armhole and into SACC's face mask. The knight quickly drops his hammer and rolls on the ground, moaning like a puss whale. Compliments about the knight's body echo through the metal suit as the goobines quickly search for his anus. Sukra and the royal crowd are beside themselves with shock and horror. This allows Gersh and Glux to lasso Sukra with their whale penis whips and pull him to the ground. By the grace of all that is sweet, somebody help us. I'm begging you. Please, screams Sukra as he watches his brother twitch and furiously attempt to remove his armored pants. Stop at once, wheezes the Peppermint King as he struggles to lift himself from his throne. Let them. Before he can finish, the king becomes possessed by a violent coughing fit. A concerned Mrs. Corntart grabs his left shoulder to stabilize him as he hacks up a large black glob that falls and creates a disturbing splotch on the ancient honey-tiled floor. Aside from Turg's whimpering and the wet squeals of affection echoing through SACC's armor, the chamber is silent. The king wipes his mouth with his bare trembling hand and takes a puff from his Rusa pipe. He then speaks once more. Luckily for all of you, we have a sweetness doctrine we have to uphold. Please, untangle my knight and explain yourselves. Gersh, Glux, and SES look to Blich for approval, who nods and they loosen their whips in response. The royal crowd breathes a sigh of relief as Sukra stands on his feet. Kill me, says the silky-voiced fish creature who has grown uneasy in the new drier environment. What is that? A fishman? Asks Mrs. Corntart. The word enters the young licorice boy's ears and a syrupy drool begins to fill his mouth. Why were Dr. Licorice and Mr. Gleiss in the lower level together? Wonders Mr. Lemondrop. Tongong, screams Mr. Gleiss. Did he say Tangang? That's impossible, whispers Mrs. Corntart in the king's ear. The Peppermint King's eyes become alert and he stands up straight, accidentally pushing Mrs. Corntart away. Everybody out at once, he demands, causing another coughing fit with more black sludge that speckles the floor and the emotionally drained faces of everyone near him. My pep, I cannot abandon you. I have a duty, retorts Sukra. Sukra, take the sweeties and their families to the top of the eastern tower. It'll be safer there. I am your king, a meaningless word without. The king stops short to prevent another coughing fit. Understood, my pep. Sukra bows and solemnly helps his poor brother stand to his feet. SAC's legs feel like 2 loaves of bread and his mind is tormented. He places all his weight on Sukra as they both slowly make their way to the royal chamber door, avoiding eye contact with the suffering Mr. Gleiss. The other sweeties follow their lead, except for Mrs. Licorice, who walks over to Dr. Licorice and kneels down to whisper into his ear. Mrs. Licorice notices Dr. Licorice's swollen, pustule-ridden face and is shocked by how pinched and bitten his lips look. Your son is a lot like you. I now fear the worst for him. One of the growing pustules explodes and sends orange pus into Mrs. Licorice's left eye. It causes her to shriek and rush out of the royal chamber, forgetting her son. The moment the chamber doors shut, the king motions for Mrs. Corntart to inject him with liquid sugar. She does so, and the king lets out a long moan. To counteract the severe head rush, he takes a strong pull from his Rusa pipe, exhaling a great plume of smoke. "Can I have some?" asks the suffering Turg, whose orange lips have begun to fade. "I remember you," says the king, who then grabs his pink cane and walks towards Turg. "So, he actually knows the king," says a surprised Gersh to Glux, who responds with a shrug. The Broomers all turn to look down at the green goo-soaked ground where Turg is nervously wiggling like a worm. The Peppermint King stares and scans his body with his eyes. He then hands Turg his Rusa pipe. Turg quickly grabs it and takes a kingly draw. He exhales, and his head instantly buzzes with a sugar high. The king stares deep into the two bright pink, glistening eyes. "I miss those," says the king, who then raises his cane and stabs it into Turg's skull. He dies instantly as 10 goo beans evacuate his corpse. Mrs. Corntart screams, faints, and passes out on the floor, while the king, high on liquid sugar and retribution, dances around and yells as he tries to kill as many goo beans as he can with his cane. "He's a good king," says Glux, who, along with the other Broomers, watches with eyes of shock and relief. Turg is finally gone, but the rumbling in their guts reminds them that a piece of him will linger for life. "Kill them all," yells Gersh. The other Broomers and Blich cheer on the king, while he stabs his cane into the last goo bean. "Kill me next," says the sea mantis, whose stressed lungs have nearly collapsed and its scales are dry as toast. "You're looking nice these days," says the king as he slowly walks over to the wheezing fish-like creature. "I saw my boys. They aren't your boys. They have gills." "Not true." Mr. Gleiss, who has slowly come back to life, is now realizing the full extent of his pain and embarrassment, and is unable to handle the strange news that the Peppermint Princes are part sea beast. "I knew they were not two apwinces," gurgles Mr. Gleiss. The king becomes distracted by the outburst and walks towards his ailing head of security. "You've done enough. You and Dr. Licorice are both rotten. You mated with a she-mantis," yells Mr. Gleiss. "Who hasn't?" The Broomers all nod with casual agreement. The king notices this, and it fills him with a twisted sense of pride for his once secretive actions. He lifts up his pink cane and whips the torso of Mr. Gleiss with it, which causes him to scream and wiggle about. "Listen here, you gooey crudball. You're right. They do have gills. Because of her. Their mother. The queen." The sea mantis is overjoyed by this admission and is given a strong desire to live. "You've tainted the sweetness," yells Mr. Gleiss. The king says nothing for a few moments while he sternly stares into the bloodshot and wild eyes of the head of security. Then a rare bubble of laughter floats up his spine and out of his mouth. "Harvesting my son's organs was never about saving me. You've never respected their lineage. You just want them dead, right?" The king then raises his cane and stabs through the shocked and scared face of Mr. Gleiss. He dies instantly. The stunned Broomers all anxiously look at one another as they are once again reminded as to how different this world is to the one that they came from. The king then, for good measure, shoves his cane through Dr. Licorice's nose, impaling his brain while carefully avoiding the pustules. Dr. Licorice is non-responsive. "I may know of the person you are seeking," says the king, suddenly turning his attention back to Blich as he makes his way back to his throne. The Broomers, disturbed by the sudden bursts of violence, hesitantly follow him there. Mrs. Corntart regains consciousness and looks around in confusion and horror. The king gives her his Rusa pipe to calm her mind. She exhales and sits up on the floor, mumbling to herself, "There was an unusual man that my sons befriended just before this storm hit. His name could have been Brundo?" "Bruno," interrupts Gersh. The king shrugs. "Where is he now?" asks Blich as SES. Gersh and Glux quietly celebrate the news. "My princes seem to like and trust him enough to invite him on their journey to the Muddy Mountain. By now, they should be just entering Guster." "Of course," says Blich, looking back at his BATS. "The mountain that some believe covers the bones of the last great Hemi." That may be true. It is the source of our river and the water is so healthy and tasty, says Mrs. Corntart, still wavering in a pseudo-trance. Can you help us reach them? Asks SES. There is another loud clap of thunder. The king then strokes his cotton candy-like beard for a few long moments before answering. Yes, I can. Peppermint Station is flooded, so I can't offer the train. But I do have another way to transport you to Gooster. We appreciate whatever you can offer, says Blich. Now before you leave, you broomers must help clean up this mess. Blich and his BATS all nod with agreement as the Peppermint King motions to Mrs. Corntart to open one of the large windows on the far right side of the royal chamber. Like a serval automaton, she says nothing and follows his command. The odious wind and rain enter into the chamber as the broomers drag the orange goo-soaked bodies of Dr. Licorice, Mr. Gleiss, and Turg across the slick, tiled floor. They groan as they struggle to lift each body through the window and into the flood waters below. Before Turg's body is lifted through the window, the king rips out his pink cleary eyes and hands them to Mrs. Corntart. Put these in my secret space, says the king. Mrs. Corntart swallows her disgust and runs out of the royal chamber. A very worried Mrs. Licorice enters as she leaves, her left eye swollen to the size of an eel's egg and red as blood. A niece? She becomes distracted once she notices the broomers pushing a body through the window as the king stands idly by. Stop that! Are you doing what I think you are doing? Mrs. Licorice runs over to the window, but is too late as the body falls out of view. She screams and lunges herself halfway out of the window and is saved by the little hands of Gersh and Glux. They try to pull her back inside, but are stopped by the Peppermint King. Let her go. Gersh and Glux are confused by his command and look to Blich for direction. He is also unsure what to do. Yuck, that's good, exclaims the little licorice boy who has run out from hiding to attempt to quickly eat his very first fishman's head. The king turns to see the licorice boy sinking his teeth into the queen's shaking gills. He screams in horror as lightning again strikes just outside the castle window, causing Gersh, Glux, and Mrs. Licorice to jolt. The BATS drop the sweetie, sending her screaming down into the waters below. "MOM!" shrieks the little licorice boy in disbelief. "Get away from her, you little bastard!" screams the king. But the little licorice boy, although shaken, persists. "You made my daddy gross and my mommy bubble, and now I am going to eat this fishman's head and be big and destroy you." "Ah, it's a fishman you want, huh? Come here, let me show you." The king quickly grabs the fat little licorice boy with ease, but not before the licorice boy again sinks his teeth into the wriggling teal creature. The king struggles to wrench the child free. "Help me, you sour slugs," shouts the king. SES, Glux, and Gersh are ignorant to the ancient slur once used against their people, but the increasingly erratic and violent outbursts from the king are enough for them to decide that they may not want to be a part of this. Blich, however, is old enough to remember, but he doesn't care. It is familiar to him, and his savior is near. Blich jumps to the king's aid. With a yank, the king and Blich pull the boy free. The sea mantis right gill ripping free with the child as the two men carry him kicking and screaming towards the window. Calm down. Look down there, see? That's where the fishmen are. Now go on. Go ahead and get big. The fat little licorice boy yelps as the king, with the help of Blich, hurls the child out of the window and into the storm with a loud and satisfying splash. The king then turns around and rushes to his sea queen. The sight of the open wound sends him into a tearful rage. "Please leave me alone. Find Mrs. Corntart and ask her about the peppermint cannon." "My king, if there is anything," starts Blich before being cut off by the king. "I said leave. My whole wretched life I have hidden this love, just to have it ripped away the moment I am ready to admit it to myself, to my subjects. Time is slipping through my hands like slime. Leave me with my queen for our final moments." Blich and his BATS quickly exit into the hallway to locate the cannon, shutting the door behind them and muffling the screams of the king as he weeps and embraces his dying sea queen. "What is it noon?" wonders Gersh. "It is like the kingdom's blowhole," explains Blich, who knows this is a lousy comparison, but believes it is the only way to make them understand and still have no real clue as to what the peppermint cannon truly is. The BATS do not make it more than a few feet out of the door before finding Mrs. Corntart. Her nerves having got the best of her, she sits in the hallway staring vacantly at the tapestry-adorned wall. "Excuse me," says Gersh. Mrs. Corntart continues to stare vacantly at the scene depicted on the ancient horizontal tapestry. A king sits on his throne while before him, frolicking candy people wrestle one another with glee and great jest. At the castle gates stands a large knight with a hardened, candied hammer and a face of caramelized reserve. Beyond the gate, peeking through a dark fog, a dirty giant greedily licks his lips. We are the bastion of sweetness for which the indescribable filth licks its maw, filling its jowls with the syrupy, icky ink drawn from the rotten flesh of sour babes. An ancient star in the vast and eternal night. We are alone, but just as the light cuts through blackness, so does the sweetness. As long as we remain sweet, we cannot be overtaken by the bitter and sour dark, those poor, tainted princes. Mumbles Mrs. Corntart robotically. Glux gently puts his hand on the sweetie's shoulder, which startles Mrs. Corntart, who quickly jumps to her feet. "Sorry, ma'am. Do you need us to take you to the special place?" repeats Gersh. "Wah what? The Clearys, Turgs," starts SES. "Oh dear. Oh no. No, I'm fine, thank you. The special place is my tail pouch. Safe and secure," says Mrs. Corntart, putting on a polite smile and patting her crotch. "I suppose you will all be staying here to wait out the storm? Let me show you to the guest quarters." "That won't be necessary. We need to leave sooner. We need you to show us to the cannon," says Blich. "Oh my, I see. This way," says Mrs. Corntart, and leads the Broomers down a long hallway to a spiral staircase. "We haven't used the cannon since I was a little corn puff. I hope it still works for you. But we've never used it on anything but the Red Arts. Such a cruel act. Aren't you worried about your bones?" says the ever-worrisome Mrs. Corntart. "Our bones have proven to be very pliable," says Gersh with a smile and a wince before doubling over to grip his rattling gut. Mrs. Corntart seems confused for a moment, while looking the Broomers up and down, then suddenly morphing into a delighted grinning, clapping and bouncing idiot. "I see it now. The gorgeous child-bearing hips. You must brew big boys to stretch that wide. And the precious baby bumps you're starting to show. Actually, if I may say so, you are all glowing, pregnant, each and every one of you." The BATS all look awkwardly at their feet. The silence is interrupted by Gersh's rumbling guts, a cruel reminder of what is to come and keep coming. Yeah, says Blich finally. "Oh, delightful. I almost forgot that Broomers and Bogos. Not that your Bogo, of course, do that. We peppermint people mate for love, but our kin must be mixed, piped, battered, and baked, you know." Repeats Blich, who recognizes a hint of pressure building in his gut. "Well, this is all the more reason to take extra precaution," says a newly gleeful Mrs. Corntart, who then reaches into her tail pouch and produces a mucus-covered silver bell, ringing it excitedly. Her trance completely broken. Directly in front of the group at the base of the stairs is a door, no larger than 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide. Opens. 2 spindly arms shoot out of the darkness and a fat, whiny face fills the frame. The face grunts as it finally pulls its purple, chubby form through the tiny door, its spirally and furry penis dragging underneath it. The creature looks half asleep before noticing Mrs. Corntart, causing it to smile stupidly and open its deeply squinted eyes slightly. "Hello, my precious Red Art. I have a task for you," says Mrs. Corntart sweetly. Her tail wags as she pulls a plastic bag from a regular pocket in her blouse that contains freshly baked sugar biscuits. She opens the bag and hands one to the retard, whose frail arm immediately drops to the floor with a slap at the slight weight of the baked good. It begins feasting, chortling and smacking nonetheless, making a mush out of the biscuit. Mrs. Corntart pats the creature's head as she continues. "Listen carefully. I need you to go to Sukra in the Eastern Tower and have him bring 4 armored bottoms to the peppermint cannon. Our new friends here wish to ride it into the Bogo." The retard's head shoots up from the mush, and it puffs out its crotch while staring intensely at the Broomers, who with a mild curiosity and slight disgust stare back. "Dey not retarded, not sweet. Dey look. The retart's eyes shift back and forth, and its lower lip stretches over its nose as it considers how to finish the thought. Salty. Mrs. Corntart is taken aback at the foulness of the language used by the retard. Strudy, I did not raise my retards to say such horrible things, shouts Mrs. Corntart before gesturing towards the BATS. Apologize immediately. The retard is shocked to hear its first name used like that, causing his lower lip to quiver as his eyes swell with tears. Trying to remain tough, he continues to puff out his crotch. This, combined with the quivering, causes its twisted little fuzzy penis to bounce back and forth. All of the broomers, save for SES who is hypnotized, avert their eyes from the awkward scene. The retard then whispers a word that vaguely resembles sorry. Good. Now do you want the last 2 biscuits? Asks Mrs. Cornart, waving the bag of goods in front of the pathetic creature. The retard's little penis stiffens with excitement, causing SES to look away. Good. Then be on your way, my little retard. Oh, and bring Walder and Coochie. We will need help pointing the cannon in the right direction. The retard nods, turns around and shows its large butthole to the broomers as it squeezes back into the little doorway, slamming it with enthusiasm. Strudy may be a little jealous of your excursion, it seems. Mrs. Corntart sighs, and then gestures for the broomers to continue following her up the spiral staircase. So, retards, are they like sweeties? Asks Gersh before being slapped in the back by Glux. What? Says Gersh. Goodness no. Well, almost, says Mrs. Corntart candidly. When baked, us sweeties rise as little tarts. This is the beginning of our life cycle. Those of us who rise and crisp up properly are then flavored and trained to be royal subjects. The royal bloodline, along with all of its purities and sweetness, has also passed down a penchant for secrecy and paranoia to each generation. Thus no outsiders, not even of the peppermint citizens, are allowed in the royal circle. The king created his own subjects? Asks Gersh. Yes, but sometimes the process can run afoul. The temperature can be off, or the batch can get a little sour. Certainly a byproduct of the sour world we live in. When this happens, the tart comes out wrong. It's not nice to say, but there isn't another way I know how to say it. Wrong? Asks Glux. Gersh then immediately turns around and playfully kicks Glux, causing him to fall backwards into Seiza's arms. BATS, stop seahorsing, says Blich sternly before Mrs. Corntart continues. Once out of the oven, the tails being on the front is a dead giveaway. They also come out very weak and with very simple minds. However, their memories are incredible and their bodies are very resilient. That's actually what the cannon was once used for. The retards were given messages and shot off to the various railway stations across the Bogo, sometimes even to the council themselves at the heart of the Bogo. But sweet things don't last out there. I prefer to let them live out their natural, albeit short lives. Once deceased, they are broken down and baked again or retarded. Okay, got it, says Gersh enthusiastically, and then turns around to stick out his tongue at Glux, who sneers back. The group then continues to climb in sweaty silence. Eventually, the stairway opens up into a massive chamber that contains the firing mechanism of the gigantic peppermint cannon. The chamber is also filled with cranks and pulleys that control the floor, of which itself is a giant rotating platform used for aiming the cannon. The massive red and white striped barrel of the cannon juts out through the castle walls, pointing north with menace. The younger broomers are in awe and a little scared. Their guts rumble and buttholes clench, fighting a slowly building pressure. What do you need to do to prime it? Asks Blich, who restrains himself from gripping his bubbling gut. Mrs. Corntart points to a group of barrels beneath the firing mechanism, then to a hatch towards the rear of the cannon. The barrels contain highly explosive powdered sugar. It goes in that hatch. We typically use a barrel per retard, but you are all much bigger. I'll let you and your broomers gauge that. I'll begin aiming the cannon at Guster Station. You should be able to cut off the princes there. Blich nods and directs the BATS into an assembly line to fill the cannon with powdered sugar, while Mrs. Corntart begins pulling ropes and levers indiscriminately. Just as the group is completing their tasks, a red-eyed and puffy-faced Sukra appears from out of the stairway with the purple butthole Strudy fixed atop his head and the two other retards, Walder and Coochie, wrapped around each of his legs. All three Redhearts giggle and make buzzing and bubbling noises with their mouths, enjoying their ride. "Ah, good job, Strudy," says Mrs. Cornhart. "Now can the three of you help me aim the cannon?" "I want treats," says Walder with a deep voice. "Yeah, I fucked Fruity's drool and I tafted biscuits," says Coochie with a mumbly lisp. "Yeah, and then I sucked my drool back and it just tasted like drool. The biscuit flavor was stolen from me," says Strudy angrily. Before Mrs. Corntart can comment, Sukra drops a crate containing the armored bottoms on the ground. It lands with a loud thud. "We only had 3 pairs, sniffles Sukra. Blich hops down from the cannon's hatch and points to Sukra's pants. "Okay then, and there is the 4th. It's for a noble cause," reassures Glux. Sukra, tired from crying and being worried about his brother, is in no mood to protest. Strudy unsuctions his butt from Sukra's head, hops down and runs to Mrs. Corntart while the knight lays on his back and begins removing the bottom half of his armor. Blich then passes around the armored bottoms to his fellow broomers, who squeeze into them with painful grunts due to their distended bellies. As Mrs. Corntart tugs the final rope, Strudy tugs on her blouse and repeatedly clasps and unclasps his hands at her, gesturing for his reward. The sweetie laughs and kisses the Redheart on the forehead before parting with the bag of biscuits. The Redheart dumps the bag out at its feet and begins grunting and gnawing. The sounds of joy attract the other Redhearts to the feast. Sukra finally succeeds at removing his armored bottoms, stands up and hands them to Blich. His tail is revealed to be huge and incredibly fluffy, the violet skin of his legs smooth and the muscles beneath chiseled and popping. The broomers avert their gaze, save for SES, who is once again hypnotized. Mrs. Corntart is also startled and blushes at the sight of such a glorious tail. Blich then painfully stuffs himself into the armor. "Okay, are we ready, BATS?" says Blich. "Uh-huh, yeah," responds Glux and Gersh. Blich notices SES and pats him on the back, breaking his trance and causing him to blush. I said, "Are we ready, BATS?" "Yeah," responds the young BATS in unison. "Mrs. Corntart, are you ready? Promise me that you will see to the prince's safety. They are truly the only sweetness left of this kingdom." Blich nods and one by one the broomers grunt and groan as they climb and fit themselves inside. "Okay, Mrs. Cornart, we are ready," confirms the muffled voice of Blich. Mrs. Corntart nervously hits the red launch button as the BATS once again let out their signature cry. "Yeo!" Boom! The sound and the white smoke of the large cannon present themselves and then are quickly drowned out by the howls of the odious Ick. As Mrs. Corntart watches the metallic ball fade out of her sight, a sour feeling of nostalgia washes over her. "My turn! My turn!" screams Strudy, who is now covered in crumbs and mush and pulling at Mrs. Corntart's blouse. Mrs. Corntart sighs and then bends down to pick up the Redheart. "Sorry, my little Strudy. It's too dangerous," starts Mrs. Corntart before being cut off by Sukra. "Are you ready, Strudy?" "Mrs. Corntart, aim us towards Guster. I'll begin prepping the cannon." "What? I won't allow it. What do you think you're doing?" "Sorry, my sweetness. In my haste to get to you, the king burst from his chambers and instructed me to send out a message to warn Asper and the princes and the council. It's a matter of security." "Im stwung and sweet," says Strudy proudly. "Yes, Coochie. Walder, would one of you like to ride the cannon as well?" says Sukra as he pulls 2 sealed envelopes out of his tail pouch and shoves his right hand into a rubber glove. "Please, don't do this," begs Mrs. Corntart with a whimper. The knight ignores the request and continues to prep the cannon. Mrs. Corntart, helpless to stop the powerful Sukra, sits down in a daze and lets herself dissociate and get lost in the pitter-patter of the rain on the castle walls.